Mason Carter was only paid to sweep dust from the floor of the Langford Aero hangar. But the night Amelia Langford mocked him in front of every engineer, she had no idea the quiet man behind the broom had once designed wings that saved pilots from disaster. When his badge was torn away and his name erased from the roster, a small plane built in secret for his daughter became the one thing that could shake an entire airfield awake. A CEO laughed loudly at the broom in his hands, never once guessing the sky was about to answer back. Stay with this story to the end, because that small plane does not just take flight, it exposes an empire. Mason Carter arrived at the Langford Aero hangar before anyone else every single morning, carrying nothing but a thermos of black coffee and a folded scrap of paper tucked deep in his jacket pocket. To the men and women who ran the company, he was simply the man who swept the floors, emptied the bins, and kept the tool racks in order. Nobody asked him questions, and he never offered answers. Yet anyone paying close attention might have noticed the way his eyes lingered on a wing joint a moment too long, the way his hands moved with a precision that had nothing to do with a broom. Years earlier, Mason had worked as a structural technician on a classified military aviation project, a job that demanded silence long after the work itself had ended. A testing accident had cost lives, and in the aftermath, the company above him buried the truth and pushed him out with a signature and a settlement instead of a name. He never spoke of it. He simply took a smaller job, a quieter life, and built his days around one person, his daughter Grace. Amelia Langford ran Langford Aero with a sharp mind and a colder shell, shaped by years of proving herself to a board that never quite trusted a young woman at the top. She believed in credentials, in polish, in the kind of image that made investors feel safe. To her, a man in a work jacket carrying a broom had no business near a cockpit, let alone an opinion about one. Beneath her composure sat real fear, the fear of losing control of a company that stood one failed contract away from collapse. Lucas Bennett, the lead engineer, wore his arrogance like a badge, quick to dismiss anyone beneath his title and quicker still to protect his own reputation. Connor Hale, an independent safety inspector known for his stubborn honesty, would later prove far harder to fool than Lucas expected. Joseph Walker, an old mechanic who had known Mason years before, still carried a folder of proof that Mason had once saved an entire aircraft program from disaster. Evelyn Moore, Amelia's quiet assistant, noticed things others missed, and Diana Reed, the communications director, cared more about appearances than truth. And somewhere behind all of it stood Grace, a little girl who rarely appeared in the story at all, existing mostly in a promise scrawled in the corner of an old drawing, a promise that one day her father would show her the sky with his own two hands. The hangar was still half dark when Mason pushed the broom across the concrete, the overhead lights humming awake one row at a time. Beneath the belly of the LA-9, the company's newest prototype, dust gathered along the seams where metal met metal, and Mason cleared it away with the same care he gave to everything else in his life. He checked the floor for stray tools, wiped away a thin smear of hydraulic fluid near the landing gear, and straightened a cart of wrenches that had been left in disarray the night before. He did not speak much to anyone, and most people barely noticed him at all, which was exactly how he preferred it. Folded in his jacket pocket was a small sketch, worn soft at the creases, a drawing of a single-seat aircraft he had been building in secret after hours in an old workshop across town. In the corner of that drawing, in handwriting meant for no one else, was a note meant for his daughter, though she never appeared in the hangar and never would. It was simply a promise kept close, a reminder of why he still bothered to show up at all. By mid-morning, Amelia Langford arrived with Lucas Bennett and Diana Reed trailing behind her, along with a small group of investors dressed for a presentation that had to go perfectly. The LA-9 had been plagued by a wing vibration at high speed, and no one on the engineering team had managed to trace the cause. Amelia wore her confidence like armor, though underneath it her nerves were stretched thin, the board watching every move she made. Mason happened to be near the diagnostic station when he overheard Lucas explaining the vibration as simple metal fatigue along the auxiliary wing mount. It was not fatigue at all, and Mason knew it. Quietly, almost to himself, he mentioned that the real problem was not the surface of the mount but the way force traveled through a misaligned secondary shaft beneath it. Lucas turned and laughed, asking the room what a man with a broom could possibly know about aerodynamics. Amelia looked Mason over, taking in the uniform, the broom still in his hand, and told him coldly to get back to his own work. The words landed hard and simple. He was just a hangar sweeper. Nothing more, and the engineers around her laughed along. Mason said nothing. He bent down, picked the broom back up, and let his eyes drift toward the LA-9, watching it the way a man might watch a slow accident he could already see coming. As the meeting broke up and the investors moved toward the viewing platform, Mason noticed a young technician preparing to run an engine test on the aircraft without the vibration issue ever being addressed. He stood frozen for a moment, understanding that if he stayed quiet now, something far worse than embarrassment might follow. He thought of every job he had walked away from before this one, every place where speaking up had cost him more than silence ever would. Yet something about watching a machine roll forward with a hidden flaw pulled at him in a way he could not ignore. A pull that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with the years he had spent learning to listen to metal the way other people listened to words. He set the broom against the wall, wiped his hands on his jacket, and took a slow breath, weighing what it would cost him to speak again in a room that had already told him his voice did not matter. Mason made a decision that would cost him everything he had built at Langford Aero. He walked to the technical review board, stepping past the line most workers never crossed, and pointed directly at the abnormal vibration readings from the previous test run. It was a small motion, a single finger against a printed chart, but it changed the entire mood of the room. Lucas exploded almost instantly, accusing Mason of accessing internal documents without authorization. Diana, terrified that the investors would witness a scene, waved for security to remove him from the floor before things escalated further. Amelia stepped forward and demanded to know what gave a hangar sweeper the authority to question the safety of her aircraft. Mason answered calmly, without raising his voice, saying he needed no authority at all to recognize a wing being forced to bear load in the wrong direction. The answer cut through the tension in the room. One of the data engineers started to argue back, but Mason continued, listing 3 signs anyone with deep experience would recognize: a faint whine as the engine climbed in speed, a slight flutter along the trailing edge of the wing, and a patch of heat building around a secondary bolt. These were not the kinds of details a casual observer noticed, and everyone in the room understood that. Lucas shifted the conversation, accusing Mason of lingering too often near the scrap parts storage, suggesting he might be stealing components to sell. Mason did not explain the aircraft waiting for him back in his workshop. He knew that if he admitted to it now, Amelia would only find another reason to accuse him of misusing company property for his own purpose. Amelia, buried under the weight of a contract worth millions, chose to believe Lucas without hesitation. She declared that Mason had overstepped his position, violated confidentiality protocols, and disrupted a critical review in front of investors who were already nervous about the company's direction. Security asked Mason to surrender his access badge. In front of everyone, Amelia delivered a line crueler than anything said before it, telling him that a man who only knew how to sweep floors had no business dreaming about understanding the sky. Mason looked at the LA-9 one last time before setting his badge down on the tool cart. He did not argue and did not beg. He only said that if they still planned to fly the aircraft that weekend, someone should recheck the load transfer assembly on the left wing before anyone climbed inside it. Diana treated the remark as a threat. Lucas laughed and told Mason he should go home and sweep his own garage instead. Mason walked out of Langford Aero into a light rain, the old broom left behind him, the folded drawing of the small aircraft still tucked against his chest. On his phone, he replayed a short voice message from Grace, her voice asking when her father would finally show her the sky. He did not answer the message. He only closed his hand tighter around the drawing and kept walking. The parking lot lights flickered against the wet pavement, and for a moment Mason stood still beside his truck, letting the rain settle over his shoulders. He thought about how easily a title could erase a decade of experience, how a single sentence from someone with more power could undo a lifetime of quiet competence. He was not angry, not exactly. He was tired in a way that went deeper than the day itself, tired of being seen as less than what he had built himself to be. Still, as he climbed into the truck and started the engine, his mind was already elsewhere, already back in the workshop, already thinking about the one project no one at Langford Aero could take from him. Mason returned to the old mechanical workshop he rented near a small airfield outside the city, a cheap space filled with aluminum frames, second-hand engines, and hand-built tools organized with a precision no visitor would expect from the outside of the building. This was where the single-seat aircraft he had been building for years finally took shape in full. The plane was not finished, and it was far from glamorous, but the design carried a quiet intelligence, a light airframe, a stable wing profile, a small fuel-efficient engine, and controls simplified down to their essentials. Mason had no interest in selling the aircraft or proving anything to the industry that had once discarded him. He wanted only to build something safe enough that one day, when Grace was old enough, she would understand her father was more than the man the world had chosen to overlook. Joseph Walker arrived at the workshop that evening, an old mechanic who had worked alongside Mason many years earlier. Joseph warned him that Langford Aero would not simply let him go quietly. If they discovered any resemblance between his aircraft and their prototype, they could pursue legal action against him. Mason assured Joseph that everything in the workshop had been purchased legally, either as civilian scrap material or components he had machined himself. He kept every receipt inside an old metal box, a habit built from years of being doubted before anyone ever asked him a question. Joseph asked why Mason had never told Amelia the truth about his past. Mason explained that his history came bound to an accident, a death he still carried some responsibility for, and a company that had once turned him into a man forbidden to speak. Slowly, the past came into focus. Mason had once discovered a design flaw in a classified military aviation project, but his superiors ignored the warning. After the testing accident that followed, the company used a confidentiality clause to push him out quietly. He lost his reputation, his career, and eventually his marriage, leaving him to raise Grace alone. This moment helped explain why Mason never fought back loudly. He had already been crushed once by a system built to protect itself, and now he wanted nothing more than a peaceful life. But that night sleep would not come. He kept replaying Amelia's mockery, and the warning nobody had listened to. He decided to finish the aircraft not for revenge, but to prove that a technical truth did not depend on a job title or a company badge. Late into the night, Mason started the test engine inside the workshop. The sound rang out weak but steady, filling the quiet space around him. In the distance, the small airfield's runway lights blinked on and off, almost like an invitation waiting patiently for him to answer. Joseph stayed a while longer, watching Mason work with the same steady hands he remembered from years before, hands that had never lost their feel for a well-balanced structure. He offered to help where he could, though he warned Mason that the road ahead would not be easy, especially if Langford Aero decided to make his life difficult out of spite rather than principle. Mason nodded, understanding the risk fully, but he had already made peace with the cost. Some promises were worth more than comfort, and this one had waited long enough. Back at Langford Aero, Amelia called an emergency meeting after investors demanded a demonstration of the LA-9 within days. If the flight failed, the company would lose the contract entirely, the stock would fall sharply, and the board would likely replace her before the year was out. Lucas presented a report claiming the vibration issue had already been resolved. In truth, he had only replaced a sensor and adjusted the software readouts to make the data appear cleaner, without ever addressing the structural problem in the load transfer assembly itself. Evelyn, Amelia's assistant, noticed something was off. She remembered Mason pointing to the exact location on the left wing and quietly saved a recording of the moment he raised his warning. She hesitated to bring it to Amelia, knowing Diana controlled every piece of internal messaging with an iron grip. Amelia told herself that Mason was nothing more than a disgruntled former employee. Still, something about the way he had looked at the aircraft stayed with her, not like a man trying to cause trouble, but like someone who had already seen a disaster before it happened. In one important moment, Amelia walked past Mason's old station late in the evening and noticed how clean and organized it still was, tools returned to their proper places out of pure habit. A young technician mentioned quietly that since Mason left, several small issues had slipped through unnoticed, the kind of details nobody else seemed to catch the way he once had. Diana urged Amelia not to soften. She argued that the image of a strong chief executive mattered more than sentiment, and if Amelia admitted Mason might have been right, the entire company would face questions about why his warning had been ignored in the first place. Meanwhile, Lucas learned of a rumor that Mason was quietly building his own aircraft. He turned the rumor into a weapon immediately, telling Amelia that Mason may have stolen design concepts directly from Langford Aero. Amelia's anger flared, not only from the accusation of theft but from the sting of being challenged by a man she had once dismissed so completely. She ordered the legal department to prepare a formal warning letter against Mason. Evelyn tried to argue there was no evidence yet, but Amelia brushed her off entirely. Her pride was clouding her judgment more than she realized, and every decision from that point forward carried the weight of that blindness. By nightfall, Lucas had someone quietly watching Mason's workshop from a distance. They captured footage of Mason pulling the small aircraft's frame out into the open under the glow of a single work light. The footage was sent straight to Amelia with a short message attached. He is not just sweeping the hangar anymore, he is building an aircraft of his own. Amelia watched the footage 3 times before setting her phone down, staring at the ceiling of her office long after everyone else had gone home for the night. Part of her wanted to believe Lucas, wanted the simple explanation that a bitter former employee was seeking some petty form of revenge. But another part of her, the part she rarely let speak, remembered the calm certainty in Mason's voice when he described the wing failure, a certainty that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with knowledge. She pushed the thought away, telling herself there was no time to second-guess anything with the demonstration only days away, and reached instead for the legal documents Lucas had already prepared. Amelia arrived at Mason's workshop with Lucas, Diana, and a company lawyer trailing behind her, creating a second and more personal moment of humiliation than the one before it. Mason was checking the wing frame when they arrived, unsurprised by her presence, though he greeted her politely all the same. The workshop was modest, worn, streaked with old oil stains, yet every tool and part sat in a clear and deliberate order. Amelia looked at the small aircraft and let out a dismissive laugh, calling it more of a dangerous toy than an actual flying machine. Lucas deliberately kicked over a bin of components, trying to provoke a reaction from Mason. Mason asked them not to touch the aircraft, explaining that several sections were still being calibrated. Lucas responded that if Mason had used any of Langford's designs, the company had every right to seize everything in the building. Mason handed over old receipts, early sketches, and a detailed build log. He proved that most of his ideas existed long before he had ever set foot inside Langford Aero. Still, Lucas kept searching for any resemblance between Mason's wing assembly and the LA-9 prototype. An interesting truth sat beneath the surface. The resemblance existed not because Mason had copied Langford's design, but because Langford Aero had indirectly reused a principle from an old report Mason once wrote during his military aviation years. Mason chose not to reveal this yet. Amelia coldly delivered an ultimatum. Mason had to stop building the aircraft and sign a document confirming he would never use any knowledge connected to Langford Aero. In exchange, the company would not pursue legal action against him. Mason refused. He told her the aircraft did not belong to Langford, did not belong to any investor, and did not belong to people who only saw job titles instead of people. It belonged to a promise made by a father. Amelia mocked him again, saying a man who could not even hold on to a cleaning job had no right to speak about keeping promises in the sky. The remark made Joseph furious, though Mason kept him from responding. Mason answered with a single line. Someday she would need someone who understood the sound of metal better than the sound of applause. Amelia left the workshop and ordered every local runway connection to be cut off from Mason immediately. Mason watched her go, understanding that now he would need to defend not only his aircraft but his very right to fly it at all. Joseph waited until the sound of the car had faded before he finally spoke, telling Mason that people like Amelia rarely changed their minds until reality forced them to. Mason only nodded, running his hand along the cool edge of the wing, thinking not of Amelia's threats but of the runway lights he had seen the night before, still blinking patiently in the distance. He knew the road ahead would be harder now, cut off from parts suppliers and local officials who feared the weight of a corporate warning letter, but he also knew that giving up had never once solved anything in his life. He picked up a wrench, turned back toward the frame, and got back to work as though nothing had happened at all. Trouble found Mason almost immediately. His parts supplier canceled every pending order, and the owner of the small local airfield explained that a legal warning from Langford Aero meant he could not allow any test activity without full certification in place. Mason found himself nearly cut off from everything. He had to machine several components by hand, rechecking every weld, every sheet of aluminum, every bolt, one at a time. The story leaned into the grinding, unglamorous labor of it all, resisting the urge to make the engineering feel like magic. Joseph helped Mason reach out to Connor Hale, an independent safety inspector known for strict standards. Connor was reluctant at first, afraid of getting tangled in any legal dispute with Langford Aero, but Joseph convinced him to at least look over the drawings before deciding anything. Connor arrived at the workshop and fired off a long series of difficult questions. Mason answered every one of them, covering lift calculations, center of gravity, load limits, material choices, and emergency landing procedures. Connor's skepticism began to soften with each answer. Connor noticed that Mason's design was not built for speed or luxury appeal. It prioritized stability, ease of maintenance, simple emergency exits, and a reduced risk of failure if a pilot panicked mid-flight. This detail made Connor increasingly curious about Mason's background. Mason did not share much, but Joseph revealed a small piece of the story. Years earlier, Mason had warned of a wing oscillation flaw in a major aviation program, but no one had listened. After the accident that followed, the person with real authority walked away untouched, while Mason lost his entire career. A quiet emotional beat followed. Mason listened to an old voice message from Grace, though the scene never lingered too long on the child herself. The message played only as a background sound, a reminder of exactly why he refused to give up. Meanwhile, Evelyn secretly searched through Langford Aero's archived records and found a technical report on the LA-9 containing language strikingly similar to Mason's own professional style. She began to suspect the company had reused old material without ever crediting its source. Lucas noticed Evelyn digging through the archive and warned her sharply that if she kept interfering, she would lose her position entirely. Connor eventually told Mason that the aircraft could likely pass a ground inspection, but warned that if Langford Aero kept applying pressure, Mason would need solid legal proof that the design truly belonged to him before any flight could happen. That night, Mason sat alone in the workshop long after Joseph and Connor had gone home, running his fingers over the old build log that documented years of quiet work. He thought about how strange it was that the very company trying to silence him might have unknowingly built its own future on a fragment of his forgotten past. There was no anger in the thought, only a tired kind of clarity, the understanding that truth in engineering rarely announced itself loudly. It simply waited, patient as a closed file in a forgotten archive, until someone finally had the courage to open it again. He closed the log, turned off the light, and let the sound of the wind outside the workshop walls be the only answer he needed for one more night. Langford Aero staged the LA-9 test flight in front of investors, press, and partner representatives. Amelia appeared confident on the surface, though underneath it she felt far from steady. Mason was not part of the main crowd, but Joseph heard word of the event and urged him to stay near the airfield, just in case his warning turned out to be true after all. Mason hesitated, worried he would be seen as someone trying to sabotage the event, but in the end he went anyway. The test flight began. The LA-9 rolled down the runway, and for a moment everything appeared normal. Lucas smiled with satisfaction, Amelia allowed herself a breath of relief, and Diana prepared her press statement in advance. As the aircraft picked up speed and lifted its wheels off the ground, a faint vibration appeared along the left wing. Most people would never have noticed it, but Mason caught it instantly from where he stood. Connor, present as an independent observer, narrowed his eyes at the same moment. Inside the cockpit, the test pilot reported unusual oscillation. Lucas responded over the radio, insisting the sensor was only reading a minor deviation and telling the pilot to continue the sequence as planned. Amelia heard the exchange but still trusted Lucas completely. Mason rushed toward the safety fence, shouting for the test to be halted immediately. Security held him back. Amelia saw him and assumed he had come to cause trouble, but at that exact moment the LA-9 shook violently, forcing the pilot into an emergency descent. A small access panel tore loose, and the aircraft touched down hard on the runway amid the wail of alarm sirens. No one was killed, but the demonstration collapsed in front of everyone who mattered. Investors panicked visibly. News cameras began capturing footage of fire trucks racing across the tarmac. Connor demanded the flight data be sealed immediately. Lucas tried to blame a faulty sensor, crosswinds, even hinting that Mason may have interfered from outside the fence line. Connor reminded everyone in earshot that Mason had warned of this exact failure before he was ever let go. For the first time, Amelia fell truly silent. She looked at Mason through the fence and saw no satisfaction in his expression, only exhaustion, as though he had lived through this exact moment once before in another life. Connor turned to Amelia and told her plainly that if Mason had not shouted his warning, the pilot might have kept climbing higher before the failure occurred. Amelia turned toward Lucas, and for the first time doubt crept into the trust she had placed in him. The airfield fell into a strange quiet once the sirens finally stopped, the kind of silence that follows disaster narrowly avoided rather than disaster fully realized. Investors gathered their things in a hurry, whispering to one another as they moved toward their cars, and Diana chased after them with promises of a full statement by morning. Amelia stood apart from all of it, still staring at the aircraft being towed slowly back toward the hangar, its left wing sagging where the panel had torn free. She thought of every time she had waved Mason's warning away as the complaint of a bitter man beneath her, and for the first time in a long while, she did not know what to say to anyone. In the aftermath of the failed demonstration, Langford Aero fell into crisis. The board demanded that Amelia explain how a flaw once flagged by a cleaning worker had reappeared during an official test flight. Amelia ordered Lucas to submit every piece of flight data immediately. Lucas stalled, deleted several internal notes, and tried to shift blame onto the junior staff beneath him. Evelyn, sensing what was happening, quietly backed up the original files before anyone could alter them further. Evelyn brought Amelia the recording from the day Mason had first raised his warning. In the footage, Mason pointed to the exact failure location, described the exact mechanism, and predicted the exact outcome. Amelia watched it several times, her expression shifting with each replay. Evelyn then produced an older document, a technical report from years earlier bearing the name Mason Carter, describing a wing oscillation phenomenon and an auxiliary load transfer design. The report had been sitting inside an archive purchased from a defunct former contractor. Amelia realized, with a growing sense of dread, that Langford Arrow may have used a piece of Mason's own knowledge without ever understanding where it came from, all while accusing him of stealing ideas that had partly originated with him in the first place. Diana urged Amelia to manage the situation the way she always did, blame Lucas publicly, issue a careful apology, and never mention Mason's name at all. But Amelia understood now that this was no longer a matter of image. It was a matter of conscience and of safety. Connor reviewed the archived report and confirmed that Mason's small aircraft did not copy the LA-9 in any way. If anything, it had grown out of Mason's own earlier research, refined with even greater attention to safety than before. Amelia visited Joseph to ask about Mason's past in more detail. Joseph explained that Mason had lost everything once for speaking the truth too soon in a system that refused to listen. He told Amelia that she was not the first person to laugh at Mason, but she might be the first person with enough courage to make it right. Amelia felt the shame settle in slowly. She remembered every cutting phrase she had used against him, calling him nothing more than a hangar sweeper, telling him he could not even hold on to a simple job, dismissing his aircraft as a dangerous toy. Those words had not only wounded Mason, they now reflected back at her own arrogance with painful clarity. She made a decision. She would go to Mason's workshop herself, without Lucas, without the press, without a single lawyer standing behind her. This time she intended to listen. That evening, alone in her office, Amelia read through the old report one final time, tracing the careful notation in the margins, the kind of handwriting that belonged to someone who checked his own work twice before trusting it once. She thought about how many years that knowledge had sat quietly in a forgotten archive, while the man who wrote it swept floors just a few buildings away. It struck her then that the company she had built her identity around had, without ever realizing it, been standing on the shoulders of someone she had refused to see as an equal. She closed the folder, turned off her desk lamp, and sat in the dark a while longer before finally heading home. Amelia arrived at the workshop dressed simply, without her usual entourage of assistants and lawyers. Mason was adjusting the landing gear on the small aircraft when she walked in, and though he was not surprised to see her, he did not greet her warmly either. Amelia apologized for firing him, for mocking him, and for accusing him of theft. Mason listened carefully, but he did not forgive her right away. He told her that an apology could not return the years a person had spent being treated as though they were invisible. Amelia admitted that she had let the pressure of power turn her into someone who only listened to rank instead of truth. This marked an important turning point for her character, not simply an apology meant to secure his help, but a genuine reckoning with who she had become. Mason asked whether she had come because she wanted to make things right, or because she needed him to save her company. Amelia answered honestly that it was both. The company needed him, but she also needed to face the man she had diminished so easily. Mason did not agree right away. Instead, he showed Amelia the small aircraft and explained his design philosophy. It was never meant to be the fastest, the most expensive, or the most elegant machine in the sky. It was meant to be the safest aircraft an ordinary person could maintain and trust. Amelia realized the aircraft was not some act of rebellion. It was a declaration from a man who had spent years being denied his own voice. Connor arrived with the results of the ground inspection. The aircraft met every requirement for a controlled test flight, pending only a few final steps. Still, the local airfield remained hesitant, wary of any lingering pressure from Langford Arrow. Amelia made an offer. Langford Arrow would withdraw every legal warning, publicly confirm that Mason held full ownership of his design, and assist with the remaining certification steps, without ever demanding access to his technology in return. Mason agreed to let Amelia observe, but he refused to become a public relations symbol meant to rescue her reputation. He told her that if the aircraft ever left the ground, It would rise because of the truth behind it, not because of the Langford name attached to it. Amelia accepted the condition without argument, understanding that she had no right to ask for more than what he was already willing to give. She stepped closer to the aircraft and, for the first time, placed her hand gently against its frame, no longer looking at it as a threat or a rival machine, but as something built from years of quiet discipline she had never bothered to notice before. Mason watched her expression change and, though he said nothing, felt a small measure of the old weight lift slightly from his chest. He told her the aircraft still had no name, and when Amelia glanced down at the corner of the latest drawing, she saw only a single word written there in careful handwriting: Grace. She did not ask who Grace was, sensing that some things belonged only to the person who had built this aircraft with his own two hands, and that some promises were never meant to be explained to strangers, however welcome they had become. Amelia thanked him quietly and stepped back from the frame, letting Mason return to his work as the evening settled outside the workshop windows. The day of the test flight finally arrived. The setting was a small suburban airfield, nothing like the grand unveiling once staged for the LA-9. Only Mason, Joseph, Connor, Amelia, Evelyn, and a handful of technical staff and safety inspectors stood present. Grace did not need to appear directly in this moment. A small flight cap rested on the passenger seat beside Mason, a quiet symbol of the promise he carried, though the test flight itself would be flown alone in accordance with safety regulations. Mason ran through his final checks one more time. Joseph placed a silent hand on his shoulder. Connor read aloud the flight conditions: low altitude, a short loop pattern, stable weather, and a clear emergency landing plan in place. Amelia stood at the edge of the runway, more nervous than she had ever felt during any product launch worth millions of dollars. This time she was not waiting for a commercial performance. She was waiting to witness a truth finally lift off the ground. Mason started the engine. It did not roar the way an expensive aircraft might, but it ran steady, clean, and even. The small plane rolled down the runway, gradually building speed with quiet confidence. The moment of liftoff carried real emotional weight. The wheels lifted free of the earth, the wings held their line, and the frame rose gently into the morning light. There was no spectacle, only the sound of the wind and the stunned silence of everyone who had once doubted him. Connor watched the data feed and confirmed every reading remained stable. Joseph turned his face away to hide sudden tears. Evelyn smiled quietly to herself. Amelia stood perfectly still, understanding that the man she had once called a hangar sweeper had just done something her entire engineering team had failed to accomplish. He had truly listened to the aircraft. Mason completed his test loop and landed safely. As the wheels touched the runway, the small crowd broke into quiet celebration. Mason did not celebrate loudly. He simply shut off the engine and rested his hand against the control panel, as though thanking an old friend for one more safe journey. Amelia walked toward Mason afterward, no longer addressing him as an employee or as a technician. She called him the man who had saved her pilot and saved her company from its own arrogance. Mason accepted her words with a small nod, though his mind was already elsewhere, already thinking of a phone call he needed to make once the paperwork was finished and the aircraft had been safely secured back in the hangar. Joseph handed him a bottle of water and clapped him once on the back, telling him quietly that it had been worth the wait, worth every hard year that had led to this single quiet morning. Connor gathered his instruments and told Amelia the full written report would be ready by the following day, though the numbers already spoke clearly enough on their own. For a long moment, everyone simply stood together on the tarmac, watching the small aircraft rest in the morning sun, as though none of them wanted to be the first to walk away from what they had just witnessed. After the flight, Connor released an independent report confirming that Mason's design was fully legal, safe within its tested limits, and that his earlier warning about the LA-9 had been entirely correct from the beginning. Lucas came under investigation for hiding critical data and altering internal reports. Diana was demoted and eventually left the company after prioritizing image over safety one time too many. Langford Aero was forced to pause the LA-9 program entirely in order to rebuild it according to independent safety recommendations. Amelia held a small press briefing, modest rather than grand. She publicly apologized to Mason and admitted that the company had been wrong to dismiss a person based on title rather than truth. It was a moment of real accountability for her character, though the story did not rush to make her flawless overnight. Mason did not return to sweeping the hangar floor. Instead, he agreed to collaborate with Langford Aero under his own conditions. Full ownership of his design remained with him. Every safety process would be handled with complete transparency, and no one in the hangar would ever again be dismissed, simply because their job appeared smaller than someone else's. Amelia accepted every condition without hesitation. The relationship between Mason and Amelia did not need to end in romance to feel complete. It settled instead into something steadier, a foundation of respect, healing, and the possibility of future partnership built on equal footing. Grace appeared briefly near the very end, in a gentle and quiet scene. Mason stood outside the small airfield, either speaking with her by video or waiting to pick her up after his flight. He did not take her up into the aircraft just yet. He simply told her that one day, when everything was proven safe enough, her father would finally show her the sky. Amelia watched from a distance, understanding at last that the aircraft had never been built as an act of revenge against her. It had been built out of love, loss, patience, and a dignity that had been taken from him far too long ago. People had once laughed at Mason for carrying a broom through a hangar, but when the small aircraft rose over the skies of Texas, all of Langford Aero was forced to look up and finally see the man they had once refused to hear. Years of quiet mornings, unspoken warnings, and a promise kept close inside a folded drawing had finally found their answer in the open sky, not through revenge or spectacle, but through the simple, undeniable proof of something built with honest hands. Somewhere far below, the broom he once carried still leaned against a wall in a hangar that no longer defined him, a small reminder of how far a quiet man could rise once the world finally chose to listen. And though the story of Mason Carter had begun with mockery, it ended instead with respect earned the hardest and truest way there was. Somewhere out there are people just like Mason Carter, quiet, overlooked, carrying skills the world never bothered to notice, simply because their job title did not match the size of their talent. They show up early, they work hard, they say little, and they wait for the day someone finally sees past the surface. This story is a reminder that dignity is never determined by a paycheck or a position, and that true competence has a way of rising, sooner or later, no matter how long it has been dismissed. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you of someone who deserves more credit than they receive, carry that feeling forward into your own life. Recognize the quiet people around you, because sometimes the person holding the broom is the one who understands the sky best of all.